So welcome to this panel on partition and its commemoration. I'm really very grateful to the speakers and the organizers for inviting me to introduce them. But before I do so, as an invited guest, both at this panel and in the Republic of Ireland itself, I just wanted to reflect on the President's plea that we engage in narrative hospitality as we navigate the most contentious period of the decade of centenaries. As we remember the fratricidal civil war, we have been cautioned to be welcoming and accepting of the traumas of the other and indeed of others. Attractive and innocent enough as Higgins' metaphorical invitation to hospitality might at first appear, we should maybe pause for a second to consider its limits. Like Ireland, Egypt, where I am from and the subject of my research, likes to pride itself on its hospitality to foreigners. Perhaps this is indeed a post-colonial condition. And yet, hospitality is seldom unconditional. So we must ask, what are the unspoken rules that govern this hospitality that we are being asked to afford others? How must these guest narratives behave such that we continue to welcome them? And finally, does this hospitality, as most hospitality inevitably does, have an endpoint? There's been an awful lot of talk in Ireland about the need to have uncomfortable historical reckonings, and yet those that call for discomfort have time and time again insisted that there is only one kind or a limited several small kinds of discomfort that we are comfortable with. In other words, how can we call for narrative hospitality when particularly Irish academic history and Irish academia is largely so inhospitable to diversity? Laura McAtackney, Donal Hassett, and myself recently issued a plea for a more genuinely global and less hypernocentric approach to the study of empire, and most of all, partition. What might that look like in the case of a global account of partition? Well, let me start with what I think might be a bad way of doing it. Typically, global histories of partition have been genealogical, focusing on where ideas come from rather than what has made them plausible or appealing. In this genealogical approach, Ireland has maintained preeminence as the model to places like Palestine, Cyprus, and India, which are commonly seen as quote unquote inspired by Irish partition. Not only is this approach methodologically nationalist, it does nothing to shake Irish notions of the nation's distinction and distinctiveness. Such genealogical accounts have focused on the circulatory careers of men like Leo Amery, who was in Ireland, drafted the Balfour Declaration and subsequent 1946 partition plan for Palestine, and would finally play a part in overseeing partition in India. Such genealogies are restricted by their Anglocentricity, reduce ideas like partition to the genius or lack thereof of lone dead white men, and fail to understand the structural similarities to partition efforts outside the British Empire, such as those proposed but never enacted in French Algeria, and such as those which led to the creation of Maronite state in Mount Lebanon. So if the genealogical approach is a bad way of doing a global history of partition, what does a better one look like? I'd argue that a better approach would see partition not as a malady, but instead as a symptom. Partition then becomes one of a number of responses to the recalibration of the relationship between religion and politics that took place globally in the aftermath of the First World War. The question of whether Irish Catholics were a religion or a nation resonated with debates taking place almost everywhere across the world. Were the Jews a religion or a nation? What about the Armenians? What about the Greeks? The fact that citizenship in Greece would be defined by affiliation to the Greek Orthodox Church in the famous population exchanges of 1923 reflected the difficulty of answering such questions. Just as in that very same act of ethnic cleansing, a Turk was defined as Muslim and not by language or by place of birth. The term nation in its biblical sense was both a religious and a political category, but by the 1920s would allegedly only be political, relegating religion to the realm of the private. From this perspective, partition was one solution proposed to the new emergence, globally speaking, of religion and politics as immaculate, autonomous, and indeed separate categories, which were to be mapped onto the domains of the public and the private. They would bequeath us too with the category minority, a new category, itself a response to the logical dilemmas posed by the problem of demographic and indeed democratic representation. Partition was unusual, though not unique, in making not one, but two sets of minorities. And so long as we view its history in exceptional terms, we will perhaps fail to see the true historical and historicist significance of the transformations it wrought. So I'd better stop here, lest I, a guest in more senses than one, overstay my necessarily provisional welcome. But the running order will be Peter Leary, who's a Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at Oxford Brookes, followed by Brian Hanley, Assistant Professor in Irish History at Trinity College, Rebecca Graff McGray, Research Manager of the Parkland Institute at the University of Alberta, Jonathan Evershed, postdoc in English at Cork, and Laura McAtackney, Associate Professor in Archaeology at Aarhus. So Peter, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. And thank you all for coming to what is a timely discussion, both in terms due to the imminent centenary, and of course in light of the recent disturbances which inevitably shape or contribute to how we think about that anniversary, and will no doubt shape to some extent our conversations this afternoon. As we are all presumably aware, unless you've stumbled into the wrong meeting, this year, 2021, marks 100 years since the creation of Northern Ireland, a product of the Government of Ireland Act, which along with the Anglo-Irish Treaty signed in December 1921, implemented the following year with the creation of the Irish Free State, partitioned Ireland a century ago. We are approaching, as again, most of you will know, the finale, or at least the petering out of a decade of centenaries and commemorations, marking this formative period in modern Irish history. Beginning in 1912 or 2012 in terms of the centenary, with the passing of the Third Home Rule Bill by the British House of Commons and the signing of the Ulster Covenant by those determined to resist it, both within and without what became the boundaries of Northern Ireland, and embracing such diverse events as the Dublin Lockout and Great Labour Struggle of 1913, the Easter Rising in 1916, Irish involvement in the First World War, and the attainment of women's suffrage. Less dramatically, for sure, than the 1910s and the early 1920s, the 2010s and the early 2020s have also witnessed change and divergence. Most significantly in this context, in June 2016, a majority of people in England and Wales voted to leave the European Union, while in the north of Ireland and in Scotland, a clear majority opted to remain. As a result, both the border and the border question, or more recently, we might argue, border questions, have returned to the very forefront of political and other tensions and relationships on the island of Ireland, between Ireland and Britain, and between Ireland, Britain, and Europe, and to some extent, the wider world. So what I want to do is to speak very briefly about my own area of particular knowledge, which is the border and the impact of partition on border communities, and the problems, as it seems to me, associated with engaging with that history through the prism of commemoration. And I hope in that way to feed into the subsequent contributions and discussion. For a century, the border has shaped the lives of people living across Ireland. But unlike the two polities that emerged with its creation, it lacks the capacity to commission a series of commemorative events. And so the first point I want to emphasize is what a commemorative approach to history risks serving to marginalize or obfuscate. If not the invention of division, then at least its elevation to a constitutional principle. Both the island of Ireland and the province of Ulster were divided, producing deep feelings of loss and dislocation. Based on historic county boundaries, the border dissected some 1,400 landholdings, at least one village, several houses and other buildings, and separated farmers from their fields, congregations from their place of worship, and friends and families from one another. We never thought about the difference between one county and another before that change was made. It was how one border unionist explained it. Determined more by force than by democratic principle, the location of the border left significant unionist concentrations in places like North Monaghan and East Donegal, and of course, a large nationalist minority on the northern side. It was in the border areas of Northern Ireland that discrimination at local government level was consistently most acute. And the history of the border has been punctuated by the very violence of which it was a product in the 1920s, the 1950s during the IRA's border campaign, and again during the recent Troubles. While it shares in a disjointed way the formative dates of both Northern Ireland and the Irish Free State, later the Republic, it took shape also through other dates, notably the introduction of a customs barrier that came to define the border for many in April 1923, and the Irish Boundary Commission, abandoned in 1925, confirming its original line. And so this history of partition through the border sits alongside, but also across, both constitutional entities currently or about to mark their 100th year. But it's also one that transgresses the temporal boundaries that package a series of events a century ago. The outbreak of sustained conflict in Northern Ireland in the late 1960s and the reaction it produced in many Irish intellectual circles contributed to what Margaret O'Callaghan has called a silence around the issue of partition and the border, excessive attention to which was deemed to be unhelpful. In a different atmosphere, scholarly interest has gradually revived. But the apparent and relative absence of the border question from the centre of political disputes between the 1990s and 2016 was facilitated in part by a variant of what Guy Biner has recently described as disremembering, implying a disinclination to remember. Amongst other things, this reflected the possibility created by the removal of customs checks in the early 1990s and later dismantling of British Army checkpoints and the opening up of many long closed border crossings, of passing from Derry into Donegal or from one part of the partitioned village of Pettigo to another, while forgetting or neglecting to remember that a border had been crossed. The Brexit debates have reminded us all of the border's continued existence. Given the nature of the memories they unleashed, it is not difficult to explain why more people, even within Northern Ireland, according to polling evidence published by the BBC, regard its creation as something to be regretted rather than celebrated, or why nationalists opposed the unionist proposal to mark the centenary with a dismembered stone map of Northern Ireland. But the anniversary of partition also poses challenges to more inclusive approaches to commemoration, such as that promoted by the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, based around the concept of ethical remembrance. Drawing on the work of Israeli philosopher Avishai Margalit, ethical remembrance urges us to adopt a model for living that combines commitment to remembering past events and their role in constituting who we are, with an effort to detach those memories from the memory of the emotion in the sense of reliving it. What, quote, is needed for successful forgiveness, according to Margalit, is not forgetting the wrong done, but rather overcoming the resentment that accompanies it. Leaving aside whether or not the memory of the emotion and the memory of the event can effectively be decoupled, this approach presupposes a clearly defined boundary between past and present of the type that the passage of a century might afford. However applicable that might be to the difficult and contested memories of episodes confined within the revolutionary period, it is harder to apply to partition and the border. The often repeated soundbite that there must be no return to the borders of the past implies, in contrast, a history that is living and might come back to the future. The historical reenactments of customs patrols by the border communities against Brexit campaign might have had something of a commemorative quality, but they sought not detachment from emotion, but to mobilize and channel it against just such a possibility. And the constitutional conversation over whether, when, and how a united Ireland might come about has never been more alive. And this too is surely part of our story in the making. So as we reflect on the events of 100 years ago, as we are inevitably bound to do, I suggest we should not limit our horizons to the outcome of those events, to the point of losing sight of the alternative possibilities they contained. We should understand how the past continues to shape and inhabit the present, and resist attempts to frame the past in such a way as to see the future set in stone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. And now on to Brian.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Jonathan for the invitation. It's great to be able to take part in this discussion. I should probably add lots of caveats about the type of historian I am and what I won't mention, but we've got 8 minutes, so I'll just get into it. Many of you will remember the various events in 2013 around the centenary of the lockout. For good or bad, they caused very little angst, I think, in either official or academic circles. Nobody feared that commemorating those events was going to result in widespread strikes, an upsurge in interest in syndicalism, or even a rise in union membership. But in the lead up to 2016, there was a real sense among politicians and commentators and people of my acquaintance that, at least in one person's words, we were entering dangerous territory. Much of the discussion about how the events around the Rising would be remembered seemed predicated on the idea that too much commemoration, let alone celebration, would lead directly to a revival of armed republicanism. Indeed, the then Northern Ireland Secretary of State, Theresa Villiers, asserted that it is widely acknowledged that tensions around the 50th anniversary in 1966 probably contributed to the outbreak of the Troubles. The question might be asked, acknowledged by who, but nevertheless it is true that, as Villiers suggested, that many academics and commentators in the Republic sincerely believed that it was 1966 in the South that led to 1969 in the North, despite all the illuminating work from the likes of Roisin Higgins and others over the years. A collective sigh of relief was audible then when essentially nothing or very little happened. Around commemoration, I mean, obviously Brexit and Trump and so on happened in 2016, but that wasn't the result of the decade of centenaries. Thereafter, I think it was presumed that it would be relatively plain sailing. That is, until Tangate last year. However, the logic of so-called shared history was always going to lead to that destination, because of course Ireland and Britain share a history, but only one was conquered by the other, and therefore it is not an equal history in terms of power or anything else. Continually noting how Irish people served in the British military or worked in imperial service, while ignoring the context in which they did so, has been a feature, I think, of the entire centenaries. I claim no special predictive powers, but I did ask at a number of events in 2016 if whether the logic of commemorating all fatalities on the Glasnevin Wall, for instance, was going to mean that by 2020, black and tans would be listed as well. Nobody ever gave me an answer, and at times it seemed as if my question was that of somebody eccentrically out of step with the air of positivity that seemed to be carrying us along from one important date to the next. However, I should say there were also positives, particularly the many impressive local events. East Wall in 2013 and Cabra in 2016 were two that I was involved with, while the interest in women's role in the revolution was often driven from the ground up. The official commemorations did open up spaces and also funding for communities to examine aspects of their own histories. A further factor in encouraging popular interest was the digitization of a huge amount of documentary material, particularly by the military archives, which has democratized research for large numbers of people who perhaps would never have made it to any other repository, although places like UCD archives have also done a huge amount of outreach work. But the official programme of events was also about avoiding discussions about thornier subjects, in public forums at least. How much of this caution is the result of the hangover of the long Northern War is open to debate. Some of it certainly is, and not all of that caution or fear is the result either of a top-down elite narrative. Some of it is due to lived experience or a fear of escalating local tensions. But there was certainly an unwillingness, I think, to talk about imperialism or to ask why so many Irish people served the British Empire in various ways, unless it could be done in a way that suggested that we, in inverted commas, were culpable in some way for the imperial project. 100 years ago, the Royal Munster Fusiliers were in Cairo, helping suppress a popular independence movement, while the Leinster Regiment were putting down the Malabar Rebellion in southwest India. And Terry Dunn has an excellent podcast at the moment on that. There's several ways of looking at that, of course, and one seems to be to attribute equal responsibility for the running of the empire to its Irish servants. Yet troops of the British Indian Army were also stationed in Egypt, and Indian troops were an important part of the British campaign in Mesopotamia. Indian troops, however, would not have been deployed in Ireland, which points to differing experiences of colonialism. Scholars such as Kate O'Malley have long been among those examining aspects of that question. Egypt and India both featured in the treaty debates, and several anti-treatyites made the point that free of trouble in Ireland, the British would be better able to crush independence movements elsewhere. Now, we cannot understand that treaty without discussing imperialism and the ability of Britain to deploy raw military power, Lloyd George's immediate and terrible war. And nor can this power be dismissed when we consider how partition, which was opposed by a majority on the island, was imposed. It's now a truism among historians anyway, and I've said it often enough myself in lectures, that partition didn't cause the Civil War. But I'm increasingly convinced by the work of Paddy Mulroe and others that the North did play a crucial role in the slide towards civil war in the South. Indeed, the killing of an Irish imperialist, Sir Henry Wilson, a man with a keen sense of the global himself, who was then playing a key role within Ulster Unionism, was the spark for the Civil War. The Longford-born Wilson was shot by 2 Londoners, both veterans of the British Army in the Great War, which again should make us think about identities. But I think a close look at the North in this period can be problematic for all sorts of people, because many of the contenders were not playing the roles that we have assigned to them in either official or popular memory. If we, for example, see the treaty split as involving moderates versus militarists or state builders versus gunmen and so on, then the activities of the pro-treaty IRA during 1922 really complicates this. The fact was that it was the pro-treatyites, including people, some who would still claim were attempting to take the gun out of politics, who were arguably more militant on the border question than their Republican rivals. There were still 40 pro-treaty prisoners, including a Cumann na Gael TD, held in British jails as late as 1926. Had Owen O'Duffy, who famously threatened unionists with the boycott, the screw and the lead in September 1921, fallen in action then, he would be today recalled as a Republican hero. As Matt Fitzpatrick, the pro-treaty IRA leader, killed in a clash with specials in Clones, is. Yet had Fitzpatrick lived, he would probably have joined the Free State Army. The 1922 Northern Offensive then raises all sorts of difficult questions, as does the response from Northern nationalism itself. In October 1934, after asking rhetorically who let the North down, an article in the IRA's newspaper on Fublocht answered, the North let itself down. The author, a self-styled Northern Republican, claimed that self-pity is the prelude to senility. If that be so, then the nationalist people of the North are well advanced in their dotage. The dreary pessimism and maudlin grief that they exhibit belong to a race betrayed to the tune of the North was betrayed, the North was let down. Claptrap and sentiment, the North let itself down. That is the plain unvarnished truth. The author went on to claim that it was only the sectarian riots in Belfast which drew large numbers into the ranks of the Republican Army. It was a gesture of self-defence and nothing more. When the treaty came, nowhere was it supported more scurrilously and venomously than in the 6 counties. The numbers who joined the Free State Army from the northeast were far in excess in proportion to the relative geographic dimension of those who joined from the rest of Ireland. Now, whether this is true or not, it points to interesting tensions between Republicans and Northern nationalists. Indeed, a Northern nationalist himself, Sean McEntee, would recall in 1968, on the 50th anniversary of the 1918 general election, that then the majority of the nationalists let us down. West Belfast, South Down, North East Tyrone and South Armagh cut themselves off from Republican Ireland. The nationalists of West Belfast chose wee Joe Devlin instead of Mr. De Valera, a choice that had disastrous consequences for them and for Ireland. Now again, there's a degree of self-justification there, but it's important to remember it. Partition, of course, was not inevitable, nor the only logical outcome. But you cannot read contemporary accounts and not see that even prior to it, nationalists regarded much of Ulster as different. Indeed, during the revolutionary period, journals such as New Ireland debated this difference between nationalist North and South. Indeed, there are intriguing, though disquieting parallels between the treatment of Northern refugees during 1922 and in the years after 1969. In Dublin, there were complaints that Belfast women wanted milk hot from the cow, that refugees stole from shops, and that they bit the hand that fed them. But those allegations came from anti-treaty Republicans in 1922, though it was, of course, the Free State authorities that ultimately cut Northern nationalists loose. This behaviour can't be blamed on 50 years of partition, creating a division where none existed before, nor hardly on disinformation from RTE or the work of revisionist historians. Indeed, both Northern pro and anti-treatyites were alive to what they saw as Southern disinterest in 1922 in our people in the new jurisdiction. And our people, of course, is a revealing term because the North contained other people as well. In 1936, the IRA veteran and Fianna Fáil TD Martin Corry argued that we should consider what kind of people we are inviting in. I have a very clear and very honest idea on the whole issue. I do not know that I'm very anxious to bring some of these people in here at all. I'm anxious to hold the 32 counties, but I should like to hold them without some of the fellows that are in the North. Now, Corry had some very interesting ideas about the use of poison gas as a way of destroying partition, which remained, thankfully, in the realm of fantasy. But nevertheless, his view that a united Ireland would not contain some of the people who'd lived there previously is a largely unspoken, though sometimes whispered element among nationalism. To conclude, Jonathan Evershed's 2018 book, Ghosts of the Somme, looked at loyalism and the importance of the memory of the Great War for contemporary loyalists. And I think that book is notable for the empathy in which he approached the subject and his awareness of the importance of class and perceptions of elitist disdain for people, even where it's clear that Jonathan disagrees with many of the people that he spoke to. Empathy tends to be in short supply online, though as anybody who's ever canvassed in an election or a referendum will tell you, shouting at people on their doorsteps doesn't tend to change their minds. Trying to understand why people think what they do rather than making assumptions about their motivations might be a good starting point for our own discussions as we go forward. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brian. Next up, we have Rebecca.
Great, thank you so much, Hussein. I want to acknowledge for a moment, please, what's become a really important part here in Canada of our reconciliation process, which is still incomplete and ongoing and very inadequate. But that is to take a moment to acknowledge the land that I'm speaking from. You'll see behind me, Carrick Reid, and unfortunately I am not there today. It's just to hide the disaster of my basement. But I'm speaking today from Treaty 6 territory, what's called Amaskwaci Waskahikan, as now called Edmonton in Alberta, Canada. Treaty 6 is the ancestral lands of the Cree, the Dene, the Blackfoot, the Saulteaux, the Nakota Sioux, and also the Métis people. And it was also considered a traditional gathering place, what's called a pehonen, for Indigenous peoples. It was a place for trade, for discussion, for negotiations, and for celebration and commemoration of the past. So I think that's a very appropriate segue for our meeting today. And it also, I think, points a little bit to how do we navigate attempts to recognize the traces of the past in the present, the dual meanings of place and name and homeland and nation, particularly where that past has been erased or suppressed through colonialism, genocide, violence, and other traumas, as is certainly the case here in Canada. And that's something that we're very much only beginning to reckon with. The parallels are not easily made to Ireland and Northern Ireland, but I think just an important theme that I try to weave back and forth between my two home places. So thank you for indulging me. I have three broad points that I would really like to tease out here, and not to overdo any of them, because I think all of my very esteemed co-panelists are going to touch on them and take them in other directions as well. So I'll leave space for them to do that. Any of you who know me and my work, these will be perhaps painfully familiar to you, but I think they're worth kind of just like hammering out here, so we all kind of know what I'm talking about when I talk about commemoration. And the very first one is that commemoration is always already political. Always. I'm going to come back to this, but that is rule number one. 2, commemoration of the state, by the state, or counter to the state is always premised on a story of legitimizing borders or contesting those borders. It's a story that simultaneously justifies the foundational violence through which the state was established, and also elides that violence and places it firmly in the past. And 3, that claims to neutrality are never neutral. I have my wonderful friend John to thank for that particular wording. Commemoration is, at its very essence, conflictual and contested. Right? So why are these things important, and what do they matter for our conversation today? And the first, to say that commemoration is always political is not only or even primarily in that it's partisan or sectarian or subject to some kind of a base political agenda. So I'm thinking here, for example, of an interview with Maurice Manning, who's the chair of the expert advisory group on the decade of centenaries. And this is from the Irish Times in 2016, where he raised the concern that the group had to actively resist being co-opted by what they perceived as partisan political agendas, or I think he used the term of state propaganda machine, and yet the sort of dangers of historians of the past becoming involved in these sorts of official narratives. But I think it's kind of worth taking apart the way that he phrased this. We were into commemoration. We were into history. We were not into politics. We said no. And I think it's very disingenuous to suggest that you can separate out any of those things, and to relegate politics to simply what happens in the Dáil or in the assembly at Stormont, or the floor of the House of Commons. Right? Politics is deeply entrenched into the very concept of commemoration, primarily because at its core, commemoration lays claim to a type of authority or truthfulness about the past, right? What are we commemorating? The past, that there is one, it is singular, it is known, and it's knowable. There's a kind of epistemological authority being claimed there. And secondly, that it lays claim to and reinforces these boundaries of belonging around what is our past. Who is the community that lays claim to that past? Who is allowed to lay claim to it? Who is included and excluded from that community? And how does this sense of some kind of common past supposedly unite and bring together that community? Those are all intrinsically political questions. And it's kind of mind-boggling that we would ever presume otherwise. So, soapbox number 1. And I think as well, this marking of boundaries through remembrance and forgetting is also doubly problematic in the case of partition, because the border is also a proxy for other socio-political borders, and not least around one's position on the euphemistically constitutional question, right? So we're not just commemorating the establishment of 2 states or the creation of this squiggly line that, as Peter pointed out, can't host its own parade. That this one's understanding of the border, its role in the past, its meaning and its significance, its legitimacy and its validity is deeply tied into huge questions around national identity, communal identity, state belonging, and in groups and out groups. So what we saw, particularly when doing interviews last year ahead of this milestone year, was that for Republicans in particular, this whole concept around acknowledging the centenary of partition poses a very sort of existential dilemma of how to mark a border that their ideology and their very purpose doesn't recognize. How to be in some way included in this conception of 100 years of these two states when one fundamentally disagrees with the existence of the two states poses a huge dilemma. But also for unionism, and we heard this kind of uncertainty and ambiguity in between the lines of some of our interviews, that for unionists, this centenary risks acknowledging the discontinuity of the border, that it has shifts in time and shifts in meaning. And there's also the possibility there for unionists that the border has never actually existed in quite the way that they have framed it as, or that their raison d'etre depends upon. And we've seen that in the way in which the union itself has now become provisional and conditional and not entirely reciprocal. And that perhaps that was always the case. What does that mean? When the thing that you're commemorating is either perceived, as with Republicans, as illegitimate, or as with unionists, as somehow fragmented and discontinuous in itself. And so that kind of comes to my point, my second soapbox here, that these uncertainties are deeply troubling when it comes to the enterprise of commemoration. And here I kind of take my nod from Jenny Edkins, to whom I owe very much. And she talks about commemoration of the state, by the state, and in a kind of opposition to the state. And how are we talking about the ways in which the state has come into being? In this case, two states, or actually three states, sort of emerging in different timelines. What happens is that there is a fundamental violence at the very core of that moment. When you think back to pick any nation on earth, there's very rarely a peaceful emergence. Canada liked to be one to brag about that, I think. We didn't have a revolution. We politely went and asked the Queen if we could please have some legislation to form a constitution and create Canada. And yet, the very coming into being of Canada as a state is predicated on genocidal violence of First Nations people, right? So from Edkins' perspective, at the very center of the state is a violence that is necessary for the state to exist, but that cannot be acknowledged as such. And in order to remember and commemorate and celebrate with parades and waving flags, one has to create a story about the state and its being, right? So this, in Edkins' words here, and I'll be brief. In the most part, memorialization of war is a practice that produces linear time, the time of the state. But does it always do that? Is this contested? Don't these accounts have a far too unquestionably consensual view of the political community? Trauma time is inherent in and destabilizes any production of linearity. Trauma time has to be excluded for linearity to be convincing, but it cannot be successfully put to one side. It always intrudes. It cannot be completely forgotten. And so when we think about what is the trauma at the heart of the creation of these states on the island of Ireland, and how successfully has that trauma been contained, smoothed over, had its troubling edges sort of rounded off. And what is at stake in doing that? As Brian pointed out, that fear around the Golden Jubilee, or around even the centenary of the Easter Rising, that even acknowledging this foundational violence would be a catalyst for reproducing it, shows that there is this impetus to try to dampen down commemoration, to talk more about common ground and continuity and unity and consensus and hospitality, rather than risk letting those troubling elements come up to the surface, where we have to ask about the legitimacy of violence, whose violence and to what ends, and who has benefited and who has been been harmed by that violence. So I've gone on a bit on that one. Right. So my third point, it comes to this, that claims to neutrality are never neutral, and that commemoration is inherently conflictual. I think this is interesting, even in the sense of, as Hussein very nicely contextualized for us around the question of narrative hospitality, or even deeply embedded into the concept of parity of esteem. As when I was an undergrad, one of my professors at Queen's referred to this as the tall fences theorem. Tall fences make good neighbors. And what we found with even with our interviews, which I should clarify, involved stakeholders in the commemorative process in both Ireland and Northern Ireland. But amongst our Northern Irish interviewees, there was a perception that there were our events and there's their events. And this was very explicit. One of our unionist interviewees was talking about the centenary of the Psalm and how it really didn't become conflictual. Says, Sinn Féin didn't agree with it because it wasn't theirs, but they didn't kick up about it, which I think is a really interesting take on it. For one, because it conveniently ignores that unionists in the North very clearly kicked up about the centenary of the Easter Rising, and that there was no common ground that they perceived for themselves in that event. But secondly, this idea that there's two separate timelines of history that exist. Another of our interviewees, who was a loyalist community organizer, said, in a very gracious and generous sort of tone, he says, we have to do this in a generous way because Republicans will want to celebrate their 100 years as well. Which I think comes to the heart of this conception around narrative hospitality. What does it mean when you have two communities on the same island and sharing the same state in which they have not shared the same 100 years? How do you begin to commemorate those 100 years when it's a fundamental truth that they have not experienced those 100 years together? I'm at a bit of a loss here because that seems very antithetical to our understanding of time and community and belonging. And so this idea of narrative hospitality actually reifies, I think, those silos of history, your events and our events, your 100 years and our 100 years. Look here, like, we get that you can't celebrate the existence of Northern Ireland, sort of in what Arlene Foster's terms here in September 2019. On the 3rd of May 2021, Northern Ireland will be 100 years old, and this will be a day and a year that we can celebrate for all our trials and tribulations over those years. We have endured and we have succeeded. Who's she talking about? Who's the we? Whose Northern Ireland is that? And it's very clearly one that doesn't include Republicans, but it's all right because they can talk about their own 100 years. So what would that look like? And what is at stake in that? How, in deferring that conflict and those uncomfortable, disconcerting conversations, what is gained in that process, but what is also irretrievably lost from that? So I will end on that point to say that on Hussein's point about hospitality is never unconditional, or it's rarely unconditional, pardon me, that it's always provisional, and that there are these unspoken rules to it. And I'm thinking very clearly around Derrida's Politics of Friendship, in which he takes us apart in ways that perhaps are not always the most clear and tangible, but that hospitality imposes an obligation on the guest. it creates a host and a guest. And as Hussein points out, that the guest must adhere to certain rules in order to be welcomed. The guest has to request hospitality, and that places them in a position of debt. And though I think when we start talking about this question of narrative hospitality, or even wider questions of parity of esteem or reconciliation, what do those things really mean, and what is being asked of us and our communities when we present those? So I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Before I call on Jonathan, if you want to begin addressing some of the speakers with your questions, if you want to put them in the chat, or you could also raise your hands and I will call on you after the presentations. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Hussein, and thanks to all the other speakers. Thanks in particular to Peter for providing really the impetus for bringing together this event. If you told me when I was a PhD student that I'd be sitting on and contributing to this panel and have Brian Hanley cite me in that way, I would have said not in my wildest dreams. So I'm fanboying a little bit to be here and to be part of this event today. I've written a few notes in a desperate bid to try and keep myself to time. So Hussein, please don't worry about intervening if I start to run over. But I'll get straight into it. In a 2017 piece on what he called the 7 deadly sins of memory studies for the Dublin Review of Books, Guy Biner observed that in debates about commemoration, there is often a, quote, confidence displayed when instructing communities on the supposed correct way to remember, which relies on a rhetoric of ethics, which under scrutiny can turn out to be little more than a cover-up for political opinionating. In essence, and while I have, or nonetheless have some reservations about other of Biner's arguments here and elsewhere, this is really the starting point for my contribution to this seminar. I suggest that official commemoration in Ireland at the end of the decade of centenaries has a basis in claims about the ethical, which deny or seek to deny or obscure their own political foundations. Arguments about what should be commemorated and how act as a mask for political claims making. Inter alia, which I'm not sure is an expression you're actually meant to say out loud, is it? But anyway, among other things, this has privileged certain narratives about the past and ways of understanding its roles in the political present. It has also had the effect of painting the events of 100 years ago as a series of lamentable tragedies, rather than as the outcome of political decisions with political consequences that continue to be felt and remade in the present. Crucially, in my view, it has implicitly represented anti-partitionism as a kind of political deviancy and failed to offer a sustained ethical account or critique of British colonialism and its legacies on the island of Ireland. My critique of ethical remembering is motivated most obviously by and responds most directly to President Michael D. Higgins' Machnamh 100 initiative, which has already been mentioned, though I have some important caveats in this regard. I unequivocally welcome Michael D. Higgins' initiative. Our event this afternoon, I think, exists in precisely the discursive space that it has sought to create. Machnamh is an intervention in the public discourse, which I think invites critical engagement in a way that I am not sure has yet been mirrored in Our Story in the Making, NI Beyond 100. And if you haven't yet, I recommend Sarah Creighton's review of the launch event for Our Story in the Making as a particularly amusing way into interrogating some of the politics underwriting this particular project. That having been said, though, there are two in this initiative important opportunities for critical intervention, and we've seen some of that this week in, for example, calls to open archives that have previously been sealed for almost 100 years. Critically, there is no comparison between Machnav and what generally passes for public debate about colonial heritage at home, by which I mean Great Britain. The President's intervention in this debate, in which he criticised the UK's feigned amnesia about its political past, was a really important one. His own contribution to the second Machnav seminar engaged in interesting ways, I think, with aspects of post-colonial theory. It didn't, however, engage with the issue of partition, which, as Stephen O'Neill has put it, was deeply imbricated in the colonial government of Ireland by Britain. Other speakers at the seminar did address partition as a historical fact, but I was left wanting to hear more about what ethical commemoration of partition might mean in practice, in a context in which it remains central to shaping lived experience and in which it has taken on renewed political salience in ways that Peter has elucidated here and elsewhere. Machnav 100 is part of a wider, island-wide commemorative environment. Its onus on ethical remembering is largely derived from the Ethical and Shared Remembering project led by The Junction, a peace-building charity based in Derry. Like the President's own initiative, The Junctions is an important intervention in commemorative debate and practice on the island of Ireland. However, the idea that ethical and shared remembering are synonymous is also, in my view, problematic. Sharedness has, in practice, and in ways that Brian has already touched on, too often, I think, been a way of eliding certain kinds of political division, relies as much on subjective interpretation as those myths it seeks to confront, and can even require the invention of certain myths of its own. I have explored all of this in relation to how the centenary of the First World War was commemorated in Ireland, which, as Brian has argued here and elsewhere, was marked by attempts to, quote, convince us that over 200,000 Irish people who took part in the First World War were completely airbrushed from history. But the war was never forgotten in nationalist Ireland. Rather, it was remembered largely as a waste of life, as a mistake, as something that Irish people should not have taken part in. Much of the contemporary commentary on the war is part of an effort to make us see it as something else. There are important ways in which this is also mirrored as my work on loyalist commemoration of the Somme and of the First World War more generally elucidates. Important ways in which this is mirrored in loyalist memory of the First World War, which particular constructions of sharedness, or what Laura has called elsewhere both sidesism, can kind of act to elide. Both the Irish Independent and the Irish Times are wont to indulge quite deliberately in commemorative moralizing, which is often couched in the language of sharedness. Some of the most egregious examples are provided by the Irish Examiner, whose editorial claims about the need to depoliticize the past themselves often torture history in order to score political points. The Irish Times provided a particularly outrageous example of both sidesism, and also demonstrated what taking narrative hospitality to its logical extremes can look like, when it ran a reply to the President's speech on empire by Oxford theologian Niall Biggar. Biggar's claims that, quote, if colonialists can other the natives, essentializing them into contemptible stereotypes, nationalists too can other the imperialists, ranks highly among the most ethically illiterate sentences I have ever read. While Biggar is a caricature, not to be taken seriously, his article read as a concentrated form of certain tropes that have, I think, otherwise defined the decade of centenaries. The privileging of empiricism over what tends to be dismissed as theory, and the recasting of particular kinds of imperial violence as redemptive and unifying. As President Higgins has himself usefully suggested, resistance to empire has tended to be held to a different standard and subject to greater scrutiny than empire itself. In a nutshell, I guess, I query the ethics of any commemorative project that acts to hold, or risks holding imperialism and anti-imperialism as morally equivalent. To put it another way, I'm not sure that a meaningfully ethical undertaking is one which offers empire a right of reply. Nor does this effectively serve to promote reconciliation, because I think reconciliation implies a degree of reciprocity which in important ways has not existed during the decade of centenaries. Katrina Pennell, for instance, has observed that commemorative reorientation and the re-examination of Irish nationalism, which have defined the decade of centenaries, have done little, if anything, to meaningfully shift the dial on British public understandings of or relations with Ireland. Nor has this challenged what Paul Gilroy has identified as the post-colonial melancholia at the heart of British self-understandings and contemporary political culture. And Brexit, I think, has provided ample evidence of this. Further, and as Leah David's excellent The Past Can't Heal Us explores, moral remembrance and attempts to mandate history are more generally ineffective in addressing contemporary social and political problems. No amount of shared history can solve Brexit's Irish border trilemma, the effects of which have recently been playing out on Northern Ireland's streets. I suppose in the end, and to conclude, I question whether commemoration of partition can or should be shared and what this means. The centenary of Northern Ireland provides space for sustained ethical engagement with partition as an instrument of colonial policy. In important ways, I think Hussein has helped to frame that with his introduction to today's seminar. In doing so, it has to allow space for anti-partitionism as a valid project in the political present and profound and disruptive political contestation. Those with the will to hold open what Paul Mullen might call an agonistic commemorative space are working against is, on the one hand, a dominant view south of the border that anti-partitionism is kind of needlessly divisive. And on the other, the commemorative agenda of a UK government seeking to compensate arrestive unionism for the post-Brexit Irish Sea border, and which sees itself increasingly as more, well, rhetorically at least, muscularly unionist. These are powerful political cultural forces confronting the critical commemoration of partition, which remains an essentially contested and contemporary political reality, rather than a subject for siloed historical debate. Thank you.
Fantastic, Jonathan. Laura.
Okay, thank you. And I have the unenviable position of having to say the last things, and everyone's taken all my good points already. So I've written this out as well, which I usually don't do, but mainly to try and keep the time. So there'll be a little bits of repetition, which I suppose is also a good thing, but just hopefully stay with me. So I want to start with some thoughts on commemoration and what it is we are doing when we reference it. Commemoration is a broad term which allows a lot of different ideas about what we are doing, but essentially relates to public, official, or communal marking of an aspect of the past. Whether this veers from neutral to negative or more commonly celebratory in tone depends on how it is framed and presented in the present. Essentially, we cannot divorce acts of remembering from their contemporary context. The moving moment of the commemorative present becomes particularly difficult to navigate when it is elongated, as is the case with the so-called decade of commemoration. The tone of celebration in successfully navigating 2016 in the Republic of Ireland was much more subdued and ambivalent in the North, where these paths were essentially separated out and therefore remained much more politically active and divisive. For the island of Ireland, the tone for commemorating partition has been impacted by the inherently joint nature of this endeavour, whether stakeholders want it to be or not, and also because the really difficult aspects of the decade of commemoration, partition and civil war, lie from now on. Put simply, it is near impossible to navigate the tone change needed from the relative openness of remembering the Easter Rising and the Battle of the Somme in 2016 to dealing with partition in 2021 while Brexit borders loom in the backdrop. Commemoration involves acknowledging that the past we remember is in constant negotiation with the moving moment of the present. This is not simply about exploring what happened in 1921 as it is remembered in 2021. We must also account for the reconfiguring of public memory in between. 3 points among many have redirected our memories to date. The around 30-year period of the Troubles was a time when difficult commemorations were shaped, sidelined, toned down, skewed, and to some extent silenced in different ways on both sides of the border. Such a long period of silenced memory has implications in terms of what can become public memory afterwards. The Good Friday or Belfast Agreement in 1998, despite the many strong defences now, inadvertently introduced many problems that were clearly intended to be kicked down the road to be dealt with later. It did not meaningfully deal with the past, history, memory, or heritage. Indeed, I have checked, it barely even has the words in the document, and was a fundamentally future-oriented text that centred the idea of parity esteem moving forward. While this was intended to safeguard both communities from each other, in reality it has reified and perpetuated a separate but equal mentality that is increasingly shaping how we can and do remember the past. Lastly, as already referenced, we cannot ignore the impact of Brexit and its mishandling by numerous actors since 2016. Theoretical arguments about whether the EU is necessary for the continuation of the spirit or actualities of the agreement aside, it allowed two communities with different and oppositional national identities to coexist in the same space due to the realities of a borderless Europe. This is no longer the case. That seismic change, alongside many other real and manufactured crises, including the imposition of a hard Brexit, has rematerialized the border as a live and not historical issue. Commemorating partition in a way that will lead to reconciliation against this backdrop is just not possible. Given these unenviable circumstances, navigating centenary reflections are always going to be difficult, but it is even more so when approaches to dealing with the past are not explicitly engaging with these dynamics. While the discipline of history has a lot to offer the study of the past, insights from disciplines that explicitly engage with the dynamics of remembering and forgetting, such as memory studies and critical heritage studies, are also needed. Obviously, the past exists outside of the documentary record. It has a spatial dimension so that a partition means and meant different things depending on where we look. It also has a material dimension. Remains of partition and conflict continue to direct our experiences in the present, especially when we are not conscious of them. The variety of insights different disciplinary approaches bring to commemoration allow our understandings to be much more nuanced and complex, which is why it is disappointing so many of the media pieces, official events, and even the President's admirable centenary reflections have been hitherto dominated by historians. Needless to say, there should definitely be historians involved in these discussions, but commemoration requires other skills and forms of analysis. My final point delves further into the discipline of history and particularly how we work with, understand, and know the past. Clearly, the discipline of history is not the same as the past, and so we need to be clear there are limits as to how much documents can reveal about the lived experience of partition and its legacies to present day. Furthermore, we need to theoretically engage with the archive in order to move beyond empiricism and to more critically question our approaches to retrieving the past. First, we must acknowledge the situated knowledge of the archive, especially in the context of exploring partition, which involves the many papers of at least 3 state record offices. We must explicitly state the inherent biases in such sources and consider archives as constructed with a specific viewpoint rather than being neutral holders of documents that we can retrieve the past from. What post-colonial scholar Anne-Laura Stoller calls move from archives as sources to archives as subject. In Stoller's study of colonial archives, she highlights the need to explore along the archival grain to reveal the mechanisms and assumptions of governance and recognize that archives are not sites of knowledge retrieval, but of knowledge production as monuments of state as well as sites of state ethnography. Any work I've completed on the past in Ireland, and this includes on imprisonment and materialized segregation, has been by default a study of sources and methods in retrieving insights into difficult and often hidden pasts, especially in Northern Ireland. Having worked at Prony, I was acutely aware of the nature of the archives were created by absences as much as presence. One had to take into account the chance of survival, selection processes, full and partial closures, weeding, and some departments simply retaining files. The papers themselves were often one-sided and self-conscious documents that provided very particular insights into policy and intentions, but are only one lens into what was experienced on the ground. Reading along the grain, they inadvertently reveal the contradictions, overemphases, contestations, exasperations, infighting, and sometimes a lack of knowledge about what was actually being managed. Overall, to navigate the absences and presences, they made most sense when brought together with other sources, be they oral, material, visual, or spatial. So what I found from my research from a memory perspective is that Northern Ireland is a place of many perspectives, more perspectives than facts. There are clear contemporary problems with the maintaining of two communities within their own materialized and/or conceptual enclaves. And this is also increasingly directing public memory, especially of the Troubles, but also other pasts. Actually, you really notice this on social media, the amount of complete myths that are just circulated, which have no basis in fact at all. A result of memory separation due to the conflicted past allows for the tendency of whataboutery as a response to any difficult commemorations, which reflects silos of partial knowledge, a lack of outgrade empathy, and undue narrative hospitality to how people feel rather than what we know. Ultimately, this difficult situation cannot be resolved by academics, but we do have a place in at least providing the foundations for creating complex understandings of the past in an attempt to enable more nuanced public memory to emerge. Of course, a stable contemporary is a much more inviting environment for such an endeavour, but there are things we can do. Employing interdisciplinary approaches, broadening the sources and methods, explicitly situating how we construct knowledge of the past, and being aware that attempting to overbalance the past or create partial histories acts to perpetuate two communities in unhelpful ways. Commemoration can allow us to open up about the messiness of the past and locate otherwise hidden and marginalized perspectives. We need to move beyond just official documents to retrieve different types of experiences and be prepared to share them.
Thank you all so much.